Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining Global Americans today for this conversation on the upcoming elections in Guatemala, as well as the political and legal implications of the election. The upcoming election will be taking place on June 25th, with 22 candidates running for president. This, however, has been a very contentious election in Guatemala. Several candidates have been barred from running for office by the Electoral Tribunal, an organization that polling suggests only has about 16% trust from Guatemalans. If no candidate receives the necessary votes, there will be a runoff election on August 20th. These elections come at a difficult time for the country. The country has growing concerns over insecurity, registering an increase in homicides this past year of 5.7%. Additionally, high levels of corruption have been a challenge for the country for many years. Pushes against corruption from those in power have led to numerous anti-corruption activists and defenders fleeing the country, as well as crackdowns on the media. I'm joined today by 4 distinguished panelists to discuss these upcoming elections and their importance for both the region and for the country itself. First, we have Will Freeman, who is a fellow for Latin American Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. His work focuses on the rule of law, corruption, and organized crime, elections, constitutional change, and U.S. Latin American relations. So pretty much everything. We're also joined by Jody García, who's an investigative journalist with Plaza, Pública in Guatemala. She's also held numerous journalism fellowships across the United States and across the region. Edgar Ortiz Romero is the Director of Legal Analysis at Fundación Libertad y Desarrollo, as well as a political risk and legal analyst. Before he joined Fundación Libertad y Desarrollo, he was the executive director at the Centro de Estudios Económicos Sociales. And finally, we have Claudia Méndez Arriaza, who is the editorial director of ConCriterio. In 2015, she was a professional fellow for Latin America with the International Center for Journalists. Before I jump into my questions, though, I'm going to open up the floor to each of our speakers to talk a little bit about why this election is so important and what key factors outsiders should be paying attention to as we look at what's going on in the country. Let's go ahead and turn first to Claudia.
Well, thank you very much for having me in this panel, and thank you to Global Americans for putting this together, an eye on Guatemala. I will jump into the second question first before getting to why elections are important in a democracy. And key factors to let people understand and get an eye or get an idea of what's going on in Guatemala. I'd like to show the 3 slides that I brought to this conversation. And the first one is about the participation of Guatemalans in past elections. As you can see, it's 1986, 1996, and then 2015 when Guatemalans went to the polls in a great number. That's very important to see. And the main questions might be what was going on during those years. And what I can tell you is 1986 was what we call the opening to democracy. We were leaving behind, dictatorships and military governments, and there was an agree to have civil participation in that election. Then 1996 is the signing of the peace accords. And then 2015, crucial events were going on with several anti-corruption cases being brought to the courts. So that's the historical that surrounds the participation. Another key factor to understand elections right now, and when I heard you, Adam, talking about 22 candidates, anyone could think, wow, what a competition. But let me show you the next slide. And this is a slide of a poll last May, like 3 or 4 weeks ago. And as you can see, all the candidates, there's no candidate in the polls, no one who goes beyond 25% of intention of vote. That tells you what's going on in this election. We have a lot of candidates, but none of them really seems to persuade people to vote or to vote for them. this tells you what's the plot in the next chapter after elections. It's weak presidents. That's what really defines democracy right now in Guatemala. And the second slide, of course, it's about another key factor to understand elections in this 2023. We have taken one candidate who was leading the race last May, and then we have only 3. None of them reached 25% of intention of vote. That's another factor that describes better what's going on in the 23 elections of Guatemala. 3 candidates have been taken out of the ballot so far, and the courts are taking these kind of decisions, taking out candidates and letting other candidates come into the competition. What's the reason for taking out the candidates? You will hear legal reasons, and that's another key factor that describes these elections. Legal that can be heard as logical or maybe legal, but actually that's a factor in Guatemala. It's very sophisticated in that sense. You can have courts explaining legally what was the reason for taking out Telma Cabrera, or taking out Carlos Pineda, or taking out Roberto Arzu, but it's common sense now that it's the second election in which courts take apart some of the candidates and let the other candidates that accommodate well to the system to participate. Those are 3 factors, and the 4th factor that I will point out is that all the candidates that remain in the poll are friendly candidates. Friendly to what or to who? Friendly candidates to the system that has been ruling Guatemala for the past decade, I will say. And what's the ruling system? An alliance. It is not written. It's an alliance of parties and courts and other power players like the economic sector, the religious sector, academic as well, that are maintaining, the system as it is right now. Any candidate that defies that system is taken out of the ballot. And I think that's 5 minutes just to begin the conversation. And thank you.
Thank you, Claudia. Since you brought up the legal system, why don't we go ahead and turn next to Edgar, so that maybe you can provide a little bit more context on how the legal system is being used in Guatemala in terms of selecting candidates.
All right, thank you, Adam, for the invitation. I'm delighted to be part of this engaging panel alongside my esteemed colleagues and friends, Claudia, Jody, and Will. And okay, it's hard to explain. I will say, as Claudia mentioned, that the judicialization of politics in Guatemala is not a new phenomenon. In fact, I argued in a book chapter back in 2020 how the Constitutional Court has played a significant role in major political crises throughout history. I mean, at least throughout recent history, So this includes instances where the court intervened by making an ex officio ruling in the case of the 1993 failed self-coup d'etat attempt by Jorge Serrano Elias. Another notable example was the court's declaration of the of the selection process of Attorney General in 2010, or the selection process of Supreme Court justices back in 2009, and the multiple confrontations that the executive branch and the former UN Commission CICIG had with the President Morales, for example. You see Constitutional Court as a big player. I don't know any other constitutional court in Latin America so influential in the political system. The key difference now is that political actors have learned that they can maximize their power by exerting influence on the high courts. I would say that's the main difference. Maybe in the recent past, informal rules perhaps encourage political actors to seek legitimacy at the international level and strive to appoint sometimes respected judges in these courts. And during a lot of years, the Constitutional Court, as a key player, played a more, enlightened role, right? Like trying to gain credibility at the international level, sometimes demanding transparency or accountability. But now this is changing. I mean, the political actors care less about the international order. They don't care much about what the US thinks or the European Union. And they tend to appoint judges that they think are more influential by them. And in this context, what we have seen so far is that even though in 2019, as Claudia mentioned, we saw 4 presidential tickets excluded from the race, and I was a very critic of those rulings back then, at least you saw a consistent approach, a very restrictive approach to political participation. But this time you saw a bit different story. In some cases, for example, the cases of Suri Rios and Sandra Torres, the court took a very pro-human rights approach, which I think is correct. But in the cases of Telma Cabrera or Carlos Pineda, or especially Roberto Arzu, which I think is the worst case of all of them, they took a completely different approach, a more restrictive one, a more legalistic approach, saying, no, you don't comply with this or these requirements, so you're excluded. And that makes you think that maybe the court, as always, is playing a key factor in the political arena, but maybe this time with a different agenda, more in favor of what I may call the ruling coalition. And that's a concept that I think we can discuss throughout our conversation. And my last point of reflection is how Guatemalan democratic backsliding differs from others. I think we have some resemblances with what Professor Vergara and Barnechea call democratic Halloween in Peru. There are some differences as well, but we share some similarities, especially given this political fragmentation. We have seen a ruling coalition exerting influence over the courts, but you can't say that a single mind is saying, this candidate plays or this candidate doesn't play. It's a bit more complex than that, right? So the only hard evidence that I can tell you all by now is that I don't see a uniform criteria in the higher courts, and that makes me suspicious that something bad is happening to our democracy. By the way, today, as we speak, a couple of hours ago, the Supreme Court issued a ruling forcing a new political ticket, a presidential ticket, to participate in the elections. I don't know how, because they ordered to print the ballots, I think like 20 days ago. And the electoral authority is like, what are we going to do now? We're 10 days from the election and the court is ordering us now to print new ballots. I don't know how they are going to solve that, but that tells you how the legal aspect has played a key role in these elections, and I don't think in a good way.
Thank you, Edgar. Jody.
Hi, Adam. Thank you for having me. The same question?
The same question, yeah. What do you think outsiders need to understand about what's going on in Guatemala right now?
Yeah, I think I agree a lot with what my colleague said, and we have been speaking about this for the past months. And I think I'm really concerned about what is happening in Guatemala in terms of we don't have separation of powers anymore. Like the justice system is being used, is being controlled. I don't know if you know about this, but the Supreme Court is supposed to be in charge for 5 years, but they have been more than almost 4 years there. So you can imagine a lot of agreements that are being made under the table to resolve the cases. And I went from cover cases where you can see like evidence, financial analysis of crimes and things like that, to just see that prosecutors are presenting an article of a journalist as an evidence of a crime. So I think this is really worrying, like how the justice system is being used to go against journalists, judges, prosecutor, but also like political oppositors from this government. And I think the sentence yesterday of Jose Ruben Zamora is also like a big thing to be worried about, because it was a tribunal, the trial say that the prosecutor office is not presenting all the evidence to sustain a case, and even that the accused in this case, Jose Ruben Zamora, was not even able to present of his evidence. So I think that will be my biggest concern right now, like what is going to happen after the election with the justice system. We will have another court. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you, Jody. Will, as our resident outsider here and not being from Guatemala, what concerns you about what's going on? And I want to build upon that a little bit by asking, you recently wrote about the breakdown of the consensus of democracy within the region. And Edgar mentioned kind of how the international community is not being paid attention to in Guatemala. So could you build upon that a little bit as well in your response?
Sure. So never easy to go last, especially after co-panelists who bring so much to this conversation. So thanks everyone for setting up this conversation. So one broad point on democratic erosion. This picks up on what Edgar had to say. I think that the reason that we don't hear as much about Guatemala's democratic erosion, one major reason in international press in the United States, as compared to cases like Nicaragua, Venezuela, even Bolivia, to the extent you can talk about it, they're occurring over the last decade. The reason that we don't hear about it as much is because it's not taking a familiar form. You don't have a single ruling family or dominant party. You don't have hegemony in Guatemala. And I think that causes a lot of people to miss the forest through the trees, at least on the outside. But what I see is that there is a confederation of authoritarian or illiberal powers in Guatemala that aren't so much focused on monopolizing control of the state. It's not that one of them wants to exclude all of the rest, but they want to exclude very particular opposing factions, right? The groups, the political groups, the emerging economic groups, the civil society groups that really propose a sort of different distribution of wealth, of opportunities in Guatemala that would be threatening to those factions that already have control. I'm not a fan personally of the idea of the Pact of the corrupt. I think it's very hard to find evidence that there was a pact, that a pact has remained stable over time, even if maybe there was for a brief moment in time. Even right now, you see that the private sector, which briefly, and I would say very briefly, united behind the cause of getting rid of the CC. Right now, the private sector is divided. So some are supporting Zuri, some are supporting Mulet. There's still political rivalries, and I think those are as intense as ever. But what we're seeing, and the erosion that really concerns me, is a breakdown of protections for people to be able to participate in politics in the countryside, to be able to participate from smaller, sort of more oppositional political parties and movements. So it's democratic erosion, but it's democratic erosion without the kind of concentration of power we're used to in the hands of just one group. And so giving that context, because I do think, with a normal discussion of elections, you would go straight to the issues, the candidates. With what's happening right now in Guatemala, I think that approach would be to miss a lot of the important context going on. I will just make a couple comments on the actual sort of electoral competition happening. So I think that ironically, these elections are shaping up to be fundamentally about one thing: throwing out the corrupt political class. Why that's ironic is because, as my other panelists have mentioned, we've already seen the elimination of the candidates who are the furthest from sort of the entrenched political class. So now what you have is this competition between Sandra Torres, Zuri Rios, and Edmund Mulet to each sort of claim that they are in their own way an outsider, that they're really the ones who are sort of on the outside of this, political status quo. None with very much credibility, as Claudia mentioned, but I do think Mulet is able to sell the message a little bit more than his competitors, and I think that's why he's rising right now in the polls. again, Mulet has been around as long as Guatemalan democracy has. He got his start in the 1980s, sort of as a center-right conservative politician. But his long tenure at the United Nations and his time away from the country, I think, has allowed him to portray himself as a bit more distanced, let's say, than Sandra Torres, who's run repeatedly for president, than Zuri Rios, who was in Congress for years, right? So I think that, try as the system might in Guatemala to make this election about crime, to make it about mano dura, to make it about finding the new Guatemalan Bukele, what it's ultimately come full circle to be about again is who's the outsider, right? Who can disrupt the sort of clearly dysfunctional political status quo. In terms of the second round, I mean, we can only speculate now. I think it'll be most likely a Sandra Torres versus Edmund Mulet runoff. In that case, I think Mulet will continue to double down on the message that he is somehow posed to shake up the political status quo. But as I'm sure we'll end up talking about, he's also cut all kinds of deals and alliances with traditional political figures, especially on the local level. I mean, that's a path to power that we saw Gustavo Petro take in Colombia, that López Obrador took in Mexico, that Colom himself, Álvaro Colom, took in Guatemala about a decade ago, a little more. So Mulet is following that playbook, but he's going to still try to sell the idea that he is the outsider. And meanwhile, I think you'll see Sandra increasingly leaning into her message that she has delivered, right? So that's even kind of an unofficial campaign slogan of hers, is that I delivered for you, referring to her time as First Lady when she administered social programs that did make an important difference in a lot of people's lives. I think she'll kind of double down on the message that I'm the candidate who can get things done for you when it comes to basic economic needs, infrastructure, etc. But again, given the political winds, given this powerful anti-establishment vote that just will not go away in Guatemala, let alone the region, I think that probably sets Mulet up pretty well to be the victor. But that's looking months down the line. So,
thank you, Will. This idea of entrenched outsider candidates in the outsider wave sweeping the region is a really fascinating point about the current elections. Claudia, I see you had you wanted to respond. Claudia, you're muted.
Sorry. It's Will. Will is saying I'm not a fan of the pact of the corrupts, and I think it's good to say one thing. Yes, it is not written in a paper. I mean, what the pact is and where the pact is going. But I think one of the fundamental factors to understand this alliance, I would call it an alliance, is that it's not compact and not solid all the time. That you can see a good exercise, and it was recently done by some reporters. If you go to analyze, the voting trends and the Congress, you'll see the alliance there and how compact it is. You can see it. And then you mentioned many interests that brings power players or power agents into the alliance from the outside, with the thing that it's being discussed is reaching the interest outside. For example, syndicates, for example, the economic power, for example, the courts. You can see the alliance. And this one example, the election of courts. The courts should have been renewed 4 years ago, and there's no single party that has moved the initiative to renew the courts. And then you can see the courts from outside, and then the alliance inside the Congress. I just wanted to be, specific in that regards, because yes, you're right. People is talking about the pact, and it can be seen as an intangible. But let's talk about the alliance and when we can see it, come together and work together.
Great point.
Thank you, Claudia. To our audience, if you have any questions, please start putting them into the question and answer box. We will be taking those shortly. Since we have two journalists on the line, I want to talk with you guys a little bit about the importance of the free press as part of the electoral process and in ensuring free and fair elections. So I wanted to ask you guys, how has journalism been impacted in the country in recent years? We've seen, for instance, the closing of El Periódico earlier this year and the arrest of its leading editor last year. So how has this pressure on the press impacted your ability to report on the elections, and where do you see that going? Jody, why don't we start with you?
Well, besides that, the closing of the periódico, I think it's really important to say that according to the Journalism Association of Guatemala, 22 journalists have fled the country. That says a lot about the dangerous feeling that we are doing our work. I know that too, that there are a lot of journalists that are afraid to go to the courthouse to cover a hearing because they're afraid that in one moment the prosecutor will turn to see us. And that's a feeling that we have to, I don't know, to process and just go to work like that. And I think it's really difficult because every time like less sources are open to talk with us, like every time like there are more people that can give an opinion, but they are also afraid that that opinion might have a consequence based on nothing else than just giving an opinion. So I think right now we are seeing a lot of fear, but also a lot of commitment. And I also perceive a lot of unity among journalists. Like we have No Nos Callarán, they will not shut us up. That is this great network of journalists supporting each other and just announcing what is happening in every attack. So I think we are in a really hostile environment where it feels like who's going to be next.
Thank you, Jody. Claudia, would you like to add anything?
Yes, I will say that Jody explained very well what's going on among journalists, but I need to tell this too. I mean, it's sources. There's a huge censorship among sources now, and I'm not talking only about the sources and the institutions that we report on. I'm talking about the auto censorship on sources that are common civilians that just don't want to mess it up and get into trouble just by talking to a reporter about a case that it's being held in the courts or it's under trial. It's the censorship that we're it's a battle, an everyday battle.
Thank you, Claudia. For many years, Guatemala was viewed as an example for multilateral cooperation in combating corruption. The development of CICIG was viewed as a huge step towards the multilateral combating of corruption across the region. However, that process has stopped. CICIG is no longer there, and the courts have been far less willing to kind of fight pursue anti-corruption policies. Edgar, what do you see as the next steps in anti-corruption measures in Guatemala?
Well, I'm very critical of both sides that I identify as how they understand the CICIG experience. I position myself in a middle position because I think good things happen, but also a set of failures occurred during those years. And the first thing I would say is that bringing CICIG was like, installing a new software in a very old hardware machine, right? So the intention was to, bring these illegal and apparatuses that were operating, in the shadows. That was the concept of CICIG, and to have this commission working along with the Attorney General. Right, but the thing is, there was like a huge special prosecutorial office, right? That was CICIG, and the thing is, the justice system couldn't bear, the amount of cases CICIG brought. Even the Attorney General office itself wasn't capable of handling all these complicated cases. Let's just remember the big case that made the headlines back in 2015. I mean, the Caso La Línea that involved former President Otto Pérez Molina and former Vice President Roxana Valdetti. It was a case of 80 or 100 prosecuted people. So in that moment, the first thing was that when they when the trial was happening, the room of the court couldn't have all the accused in the room, and they were saying, okay, we need a different room because the justice system wasn't prepared for that. So I think some good things happened. I mean, a lot of corruption cases were discovered, La Línea, cooptación del Estado. I mean, that's a lot of cases that we saw over the years. But the thing is, maybe we have to understand that these, things doesn't change only throughout a judicial process, right? So the thing with CICIG was that you never saw a political party, or a political coalition saying, okay, we are taking this seriously, we are going to make reforms, and we are going to fight corruption as a political coalition. You have like the enemies of CICIG, most political parties were, affected by those investigations. But on the other side, you have like a coalition that say, okay, let's not talk about that. If you go back to 2019, the year CICIG ended its mandate in Guatemala, you could find a few candidates talking about CICIG. I mean, there was like a, dead experiment back then. And for me, the lesson is it's impossible to change things from the outside without the support of the political class or the support of civil society. And that to me, it's a big example. Guatemala is not alone in that. I mean, we saw the MASI in Honduras, a similar anti-corruption commission that, ended in failure. I'm not saying they brought important cases in front of the courts. I'm speaking about the how effective those experiments were at the end. I mean, the first proof that it was not a success is that it's no longer here. It's gone. And now things look very different for prosecutors or judges who were involved in those investigations. So I think it was an interesting experiment, but at the end, I mean, the main lesson I drew from that period is you can't change things without the political, outside the political arena, right? So, and the second lesson I will draw is, anti-corruption operations are never politically neutral. It's impossible. You saw that in Brazil as well. It's very funny because if you hear the complaints in Brazil from the left, are the same complaints you heard in Guatemala from the right. This is a political process. This is a this is partisan. This is to favor the right wing. You hear the same here. So the thing is, those operations are not neutral. And at the end of the day, nothing really changed in our system. I mean, we wouldn't see enough reforms to fight corruption, because corruption, obviously, it is important to prosecute the bad guys, but it's also important to change the sources of corruption, right? And that never happened because the political class never backed these efforts. And that's what I say.
Thank you, Edgar. I see we have several questions coming in, but I think Will wanted to say something on that as well.
And just briefly, I think it's instructive to look back on the conditions in leading up to 2007, when Guatemalan politicians invited CICIG into the country. The country was confronting violent crime like it never had before. The Parlacén murders, the killing of these 3 Parlacén deputies on Guatemalan territory, was really a catalyst to a number of politicians who were very hostile to the idea of a multilateral coming in and assisting the justice system to essentially say, okay, well, I guess we have no other means of doing this but with outside help. So I think, and that was, of course, all before the CICIG had actually proven that it could investigate corruption and take down powerful people, right? So what I found talking to many of these politicians is that they were even now they admit, we had no idea the CICIG and the justice system domestically would be capable of these things. And if we had known that, we wouldn't have let CICIG in the country. So, I think that now that a mechanism like CICIG has demonstrated that it can achieve, can make the inroads it did in terms of the powerful, big investigations, it's even less likely that, domestic elites would be willing to invite that kind of mechanism back into the country. Just, for what it's worth, I've even heard that, Edmund Mulet, who has this background as a conservative politician, he actually is faced with a lot of distrust among kind of conservative and right-wing sectors in business and among politics, because they see him as a globalist for having worked at the United Nations. I mean, keep in mind, he was leading the peacekeeping mission to Haiti. So it was, it's kind of a funny label to pin on him. He's not a leftist guy. But nonetheless, just his association with the United Nations has, in some circles, led him to be branded as a globalist and kind of cast aside or ruled out from the get-go. So I think it shows you sort of the reputation that multilaterals now have among the more hardline conservative elements who hold a lot of power in Guatemala.
Thank you, Will. I'm going to turn over to a question from Christina Mani. She wants to know, how do you think the leverage of foreign states or organizations vis-a-vis Guatemala has changed over the last decade? And are there ways that outside actors could or should undertake more constructive steps to promote democracy and rule of law in the country? Anyone want to take that one on right away? Go for it, Edgar.
Okay, I think it's very hard for the international community to engage with local governments. I mean, we are under a big narrative, globally, not just in Guatemala. I mean, one of the things that you can listen in this political campaign is there are a bunch of parties, who are against the 2030 agenda, right? So these globalists, bad people who want to impose progressive values on us. So in a highly conservative country, that's a barrier for international community. And so I think that's just one example. Another example is, how do you convince, again, the political elites that, for them, the dark times from the past are not coming back. It's very hard to regain their confidence right now and to convince them that a new effort is possible. So it is my understanding that there's a very limited capacity that outside actors have over Guatemala. I have this conversation frequently with international cooperation actors, and all I can say is maybe the agenda should shift towards a more constructive approach in terms of building capabilities, right? But even those efforts are really hard now because of the distrust of the political actors towards the international community. So I'm very pessimistic in that respect.
Thank you, Edgar. Go ahead, Claudia.
I'm a little bit more, I will ask more for multilateral mechanisms. Guatemala is not alone. Guatemala forms part of the OAS. Guatemala forms part of the Commission of Human Rights. So Guatemala is not isolated. I mean, what we need now and what the times are telling us is that the times in which the international and multilateral organisms run are really, out of context. We need effective responses. Alejandro Yamate's invoked the democratic letter, the Carta Democrática. He invoked it in 2020. November 2020, and there's a report, a full report of the OAS Commission that came to Guatemala, and there's a route to take Guatemala out of the hole in which is right now, but there's no follow-up, and we have that mechanism. I mean, we believe in democracy, right? We all believe in democracy, and part of that democracy is being part of OAS. Then we also form part of the Convention of Human Rights, El Pacto de San Jose. And it's just, unbelievable that we're having Jose Rubén Zamora into this case, and he's invoking and thinking about going to international courts. And just think about it. It's 10 to 12 years to get a response from an international commission from an international court. So we have the tools, we have the democratic tools, and I will only point out that we need that those democratic and international mechanism should be thinking about, like re-engineering of the process and how to act more active and how to have responses in a more effective way. Look at it. I mean, look at Ukraine and Russia and what international community has done towards that. And we all were thinking it's too slow. And I think history will show us, I mean, what's the effect and what needs to be changed. But I think we have that international community working inside or international mechanism working with more legally binding effects inside.
Thank you, Claudia. I think Edgar has a response for you as well.
Just a quick response. Two things. First thing is I forgot to mention that all the candidates excluded by the Constitutional Court or highest court, the court ignored completely the jurisprudence of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. There is a lot of evidence, case of Leopoldo Lopez against Venezuela, the case of Petro versus Colombia, they ignored that completely. They didn't even mention the jurisprudence in their rulings. And the second thing is to show, I mean, we have tools, Claudia is right, but I'm trying to say how ineffective they are. Look at Nicaragua, look at El Salvador, Venezuela. I mean, all the backsliding in those countries has occurred without this system capable of doing something. So that's what I say. I'm a pessimistic, but I just wanted to point out that.
Thank you, Edgar. Will, Jody, do either of you have anything you'd like to add to that question?
I mean, I agree with both, like in the terms that we have the democratical tools, but I question like how someone like Jose Raven Zamora have more trust in waiting for 10 years for international court to resolve his case than just wait in Guatemala. It's just like, that's really impressive that you will believe, like someone believes that in 10 years, like things will not be changing in here, so you have a better chance to have a response outside. So I think that's really worrying.
I'll just add, I know we're mostly talking about multilaterals here, but just briefly on the bilateral relationship between the United States and Guatemala. Something I heard increasingly when I was in Guatemala last year, right, is that the US just has a fraction of the sort of soft power and the leverage that it used to. I think that might be true, but we're also not seeing this administration use the toughest tools at its disposal to exert pressure on the Gimate government by a mile. Right. And I think there's a very clear reason for that. Maybe it's stating the obvious, but it's that the United States depends on Guatemala as part of its sort of border security regime. It's something I've written about called border first foreign policy, where, ultimately a lot of other concerns that this administration or others might have in the region get subjugated to, get put second to control of the US-Mexico border. I mean, you can, best evidence there is just, a few weeks ago, the US opened a new migrant processing center, helping open a new migrant processing center on Guatemalan territory at the same time that, administration officials are tweeting about how the conviction against Zamora is, a threat to free press. It's kind of, there's this attempt to walk this line between being a partner of Guatemala, but also a critic. And I think it's that sort of uncomfortable middle ground, which this administration, I would argue, and others have viewed as electorally necessary in the US. You need to do this to have a shot at winning re-election. You need to focus on the border, but that means that you're not willing to use the tools that would maybe really provoke a response. And in the process, you run down sort of your credibility and your leverage. So I do think that that's a bilateral part of the story that's probably as important, I would argue, as the multilateral one here.
Thank you, Will. And that's a perfect segue into a couple of questions that we've gotten from the audience. We have two questions that have come in about the role of the US in the US elections and why the US general populace should care about what's going on in Guatemala and these elections. So not only why do the elections matter to the US populace, but also noting and kind of building on what you just said, we have an audience member who asked, we've seen a lot from Guatemala working with the Biden administration in terms of immigration. If the election goes towards the GOP in 2024 in the United States, do you expect to see a shift in Guatemalan politics as well?
Well, I can go with this. I think it's hearing Will and reading the question. I don't know, it's like the textbook of how to become a charming authoritarian, like how to be a false friend, giving this hand and take with this other, and the United States playing, perfectly its role, like giving and taking. It's a give and take play here game. I don't think there will be a shift in the U.S. As it wasn't in terms of migration, for example. We didn't see a shift from Trump to Biden. I won't diminish the forms. Those change a lot, but the integral reform is not happening. We're becoming third safe countries, and that's a big change. But migration, it's not going to stop with that. I mean, you just need to see the numbers in the last 3 years. Not even a pandemic hold us here. So I think it's, what the numbers and the fluxes are telling us is that, there should be another way to fix this. And I'm talking about a pandemic, but we're not talking about climate change. And for the first time, I think it was the Migration Policy Institute that did this big survey, and they've registered, climate change as a reason to migrate. First was violence, you can have poverty, then violence, but then, ERA and YORA show us that, there was another third reason for now to migrate. So I don't see a shift coming. I would like to see the integral, reform. There's an interview of Alejandro Yamatei in Univision. It's a good interview. Of course, he gives this kind of phrases that are make out of a scandal in the internet, but there's more in that interview. He calls himself the Mata Caravanas, as an achievement. There are no more caravanas, he says. But then he says he reflects as the president of the country if that is working, and he himself responds, it's not working. I mean, we need another approach, and it's not happening. So I don't know if the answer is coming from the president itself, and I think that's an authentic answer. He has seen the problem, and he has seen that being or becoming a Mata Caravanas, serves him, but it doesn't serve, it doesn't serve it serves the US, yes, at a certain point, but it doesn't serves well if the goal is, to have migrations that follow, a policy of, a policy.
Will, Edgar, I see you both had responses that you wanted to add to that.
Sure, I can just state mine briefly. I think, why does this matter for the U.S.? Well, first, there's a large Guatemalan American community in the United States. Guatemalans are citizens of the U.S., live in the U.S. as well. So it's an important diaspora. Two, I think in terms of migration, look, it's true, exactly as Claudia points out. Although Giammattei and presidents before him in Guatemala have sold the Guatemalan government as a partner on migration, and although we do see this sort of collaboration on enforcement in certain areas, Guatemalans remain one of the largest groups each month to arrive at the US-Mexico border, right? So the lack of a solution to the root cause issues that driving people to abandon their homes, to flee their homes across Guatemala, especially in places like the dry corridor that Claudia alludes to with the climate change comment. I mean, that's undermining Guatemala status as a true partner on migration. And if those root causes were attended to properly, as difficult as a task as that might be, that would be less pressure on the U.S. border. So I think that's another reason that matters. And then, a final one, and I'm not speaking, this isn't my personal opinion. This is not what I consider most important in Guatemala, but I do think that especially in the Republican Party, there's this view that we have no partners left in Latin America geopolitically. We have Paraguay, we have Ecuador for 2 more months, and we have GMT in Guatemala. That's, the line you hear if you go to Capitol Hill these days. And what I try to tell those audiences, what I believe is that, sure, that's the case for now, but how many more GMTs before you do see a party like Codeca MLP, which will not be a geopolitical friend of the United States, win office, right? I mean, so I do think in terms of the long-term sort of balance of a geopolitical balance in Latin America, having this powder keg, this country that's increasingly authoritarian, doesn't provide for the welfare of its citizens, but which enjoys this cozy relationship with the US, eventually that pendulum is going to swing, right? And I do think in the long run that would affect US interests. So.
Thank you, Will. Edgar?
No, I think they covered mostly, but I would say just a couple of things. Maybe the thing with migration is that, elections are every 2 years in the States, and the solutions for migration are long-term. So you have this incentive in the short term to do something immediate. Otherwise, you will lose elections. And so you tend to, oversee the bad things that happen in our country, especially in the GOP, with this vision that, Guatemala is a partner, which is true. I mean, we're pro-Taiwan, etc. But the thing is, I think the problem I want to emphasize, as Will mentioned, has to be framed in the long term. I think Guatemala now, I don't see Guatemala right now at that, huge risk of instability, but I don't know in 4 or 6 years. I mean, things can change, can deteriorate badly if you wouldn't do something now. So that's the key factor to bear in mind. This is not forever. I mean, there are some fundamental sociological and economic, arguments to believe that situation can get worse in the coming years.
Thank you, Edgar. We're quickly approaching the hour mark, and I want to be respectful of all of your time. But we have a couple more questions from the audience that I think are really interesting, and I'd love to get your insights on. We have a question coming in that says, given Guatemala's political and institutional capacities, many of the candidates have made promises of Mano Duro policies and implementing those in the country. But can these candidates deliver on those promises, and what would be the repercussions for Guatemalan society if those policies were enacted? Anyone want to go first on that one?
I can go. I think if we see the example of El Salvador, we have seen a lot of reports that saying that there's a lot of human rights violations because of this policy. And in Guatemala, we don't have something like that, but we have had examples of what can happen if the government just takes everyone's rights and just decides to detain people. Like, for example, in El Estado, in the north of Guatemala, we have seen that these kind of policies have been used to break the structure of organized communities that defend land, defend territories. So I think it will be really concerning that a lot of activists and human rights defenders and land defenders can be detained over policies like this. And also, we already have overcrowded prisons. We already hear a lot of abuse inside the prison. So I cannot imagine how that can be another crisis for Guatemala.
Thank you, Jody. And then one last set of questions from the audience before we end here. We have a couple of questions that have come in specifically on the election itself. So the first one is about, and we'll use this to kind of close up and any final remarks that each of you have as well. why do you think that anti-corruption parties have not attracted as much voter support in the country as one would expect, given the challenges facing the country? And likewise, do you see a Millet presidency slowing down Democratic backsliding or not, given his credentials within the international community? Since we'll do this as kind of a closing round, why don't we go the opposite direction of where we started? So Will, why don't you go ahead and kick us off?
Sure, thanks. Let me just speak to the second question. I think I'm, being outside the country right now, I'm better positioned maybe to do that. So in terms of would Millet, I think that's the $1 million question. Would he slow down or reverse some of this democratic erosion? Would he stop or wind down the weaponization of the public prosecutor's office against government critics? I think here you have to really try to read between the lines because on the one hand, as I started off my contribution to this discussion saying I think there's a lot of electoral advantage right now in sounding like an outsider and sounding like an anti-corruption advocate, even if you're not. So to the extent that Millet has leaned into that message, maybe it's because he's looking for votes, right? And that's the sort of cynical interpretation. But I think there's another interpretation that, look, he might be part of the old political guard, but he sees that there's something deeply wrong and this is unsustainable. He himself says in a lot of his writing and public comments that he's seen a broken political and social system in Haiti. He's seen it elsewhere that he's served with the United Nations. He doesn't want Guatemala to go down the same route. To the extent that we trust him on his word, I think he could be coming at this with genuine intention. That covers the sort of intention side of it. What about capacity? That's where I'm more concerned. So even if he does mean well, look, some members of his team do not have skeletons in the closet and seem like they're well positioned to begin some program of reforms to at least stop the sort of abuses of the Jimate years. But he also has built a coalition, especially at the local regional level, of a lot of pretty illiberal actors. And so to the extent that constrains him, to the extent that he has to deal with what will surely be an opposition-dominated legislature that's intent on extracting concessions for itself, that's realized the immense power that comes with Congress and all that Congress can extract from a weak president, I think the capacity side of this question of whether or not Millet could wind down democratic backsliding, that's going to be the big unknown.
Thank you, Will. Jody?
Can I pass this one?
Sure thing. Edgar?
Right. So I think, as they were asking why anti-corruption parties didn't have a shot. Sometimes I think, we have to explain something. In Guatemala, we live a transition. We transition from the imperial presidency, hyper-presidentialism is a frequent feature in Latin American democracies. But in case of Guatemala, in the last 8 years, we have transitioned from that imperial presidency towards a feudal system. We have a lot of political parties, local leaders. Our proportional formula for electing congressmen makes has an incentive to form new parties and to compete for a small share of power. So the big question is, okay, I don't know if it's Millet or Sandra or who is going to win, but they will face 20 or 21 political parties represented in Congress next year. Each local actor with demanding power and demanding rents from the state, and that's for me the key problem. How do you get out from that, and how do you transition from that crazy feudal system towards a more stable way of government? And to me, that's a big challenge, and I don't think that's going to change with in these elections. But the thing is, I think that the opposition has to understand that even though the incentives are set to run in multiple parties, they need to understand that the only way to change things is to agree on a minimum agenda. The country, democracy is turning apart, and everyone has its small agenda. They want to advance this or this right, and that's not going to work unless they understand and they agree on a small agenda, and they build like a big coalition. In an election with 22 presidential candidates, it is impossible to win against, the 3 or 4 most, the candidates with higher rates of name recognition, which is the biggest asset you have in an election like this. So I think the strategy has to change in order to see something new. I don't think that's going to happen now because they are all fragmented, but maybe in 4 years, they realize that the winning strategy is to unite in a coalition, and maybe they will change if the country is still alive with them.
Thank you, Edgar. And Claudia.
You know that I've been reading about the history of countries that have been through a situation similar to Guatemala, and I can only think about what Edgar is saying. I think there's an example in Lithuania. I mean, it's just small groups. They're too small. I mean, they can be abstract. They coming together into a coalition with a single and basic agenda. They are not going to agree in everything. But what we saw in this election is that they are very, very comfortable. Maybe this is the most critical, comment to opposition. They are very comfortable with the role they are playing because they're getting their felt too, even though it's too little. I mean, it's very comfortable. Look at look at the left. I mean, they are very comfortable with the one position they have at the Congress, and they don't do more. They've been there like for 20 years, and it's very pleasable to get, what you get, to get your seats in the partisan, to get your seats in the municipalities, to get your seats in Congress. So they are very accommodated to the system as well. Going back to the slides that I showed at the beginning, it's Guatemala will go beyond, if we're having leaders as weak as we have them. That's what explains a phenomenon like Carlos Pineda in this election. Anything that looks different to what we have here, I mean, will get, the votes. And he was very successful in terms of doing it, in 2 years. There's the opposition is not getting the message, and they are very, happy with what they have because they're getting the piece and the cake.
Thank you, Claudia. With that, we will close our meeting for today. Thank you, everyone, including our panelists, for a wonderful conversation, our audience for attending. Please stay tuned for more work coming from Global Americans. We host these events regularly. If you're not already registered, please sign up for our newsletter and make sure to check our website, theglobalAmericans.org, where we publish regularly on the most pressing issues facing the Western Hemisphere. Thank you, everyone.